Nazi propaganda changed its position with regard to Russia several times. The first more or less official position was taken by Hitler himself in his book Mein Kampf. I had read the book only superficially, but I did recall that the Führer pointed to the European part of the vast Eurasian Empire as Germany's future Lebensraum. The word, as simple as it looks, is difficult to translate. Its literal meaning is living space, but the concept it stands for is territory to be conquered. I did not have the foggiest idea how he thought to realize the implied expansion, but I did remember that he dwelled on 2 points. First, Hitler portrayed the October Revolution in Russia as a triumph of international Jewry. Trotsky was represented as an agent of the Jews who pulled the strings behind Lenin's and Stalin's backs. The second point was that the Bolshevists had ruined Russia beyond repair. According to Hitler, Russia was a rotten colossus ready to collapse at the slightest push. Strangely, a single sentence, rather vacuous to boot, stuck in my memory. Talking about the decaying empire in the East and Germany's future Lebensraum, Hitler wrote, "Fate seems to give us a hint here." Today I know that he meant conquest. At the time I did not. The scraps of memory from his book led me to believe that Germany merely had to wait until harvest time in the East arrived. In the Jungvolk, under Haino's direction, we sometimes intoned a sombre song that began, "Do you see in the East the morning glow?" In spite of its gloomy mood and the minor key, the song always struck me as an imploring admonition. The refrain of "People to arms" sounded like a command. True, these ominous words could have been a warning to me, but I was too inexperienced to infer from circumstantial evidence, such as a song, the intentions of the Führer. I did not have the faintest idea that in his vocabulary Lebensraum meant conquest and war. Haino had a better nose. He was obsessed with Russia, Cossacks, the vast spaces, the mighty rivers, and the enormous resources. He always referred to the Russian steppe as the cradle and the future Lebensraum of the Aryan race. Once he boasted that he had read only 2 books in his life, Mein Kampf and Volk ohne Raum, Nation Without Space. I can't recall the author of the second book, but I do remember that it caused quite some stir at the time. Today I am inclined to believe that Haino was one of the few Nazis with whom I came in contact who knew exactly what Hitler had in mind. Sometime in late 1938 or early 1939, before the campaign against Poland, Nazi propaganda performed a U-turn. Suddenly Stalin was represented as a kind of jovial Uncle Joe, who actually tried to deliver Russia from the Jewish enslavement that was the legacy of Lenin and Trotsky. He already had banished Trotsky from Russian soil and was now conducting a series of courageous anti-Semitic cleansing actions to liberate his country from Jewish domination. This new drift seemed to confirm my belief that a war with Russia was neither necessary nor planned. Thus, the attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941 took me and most other Germans completely by surprise. Only those who were directly involved in it had been prepared. Thus, Nazi propaganda had to perform a second U-turn. Now it turned out that Stalin was the worst of the communist leaders, who was dreaming of a Pan-Slav empire extending westward to the Vistula and the Danube. In pursuing this goal, he tried to blackmail Germany by demanding huge territories on the Baltic, in Poland, and in the Balkan sector. But the Führer had thwarted his megalomania by launching a preventive attack. I was still managing the little mock airfield in the vicinity of Berlin when I heard the news of the attack on Russia on the radio. At first I could not believe it, but as the news sank in, I became devastated. I always had entertained fond dreams of a cavalier war against the Western powers that would lead to an early peace. Now this dream was shattered. Now we had a war on 2 fronts, a strategic situation that always had been a German nightmare. Of course, had I known that Hitler would declare war on America about 6 months later, I would have been even more confounded. But the current situation was bad enough. In spite of the propaganda and reports about the early military successes, there was no doubt in my mind that the war had now escalated to a serious and bloody conflict. I would soon find out how right I was. In the fall of 1941, Helmut and I received marching orders to an undisclosed destination. We travelled to Hamburg, where we joined a group of about 24 Luftwaffen foot soldiers. Each carried his rifle and a backpack with all of his belongings. Most were regulars, a few like Helmut were conscripts, and I was the only volunteer. The group leader was an old private who banded with the other regulars against me because I was a corporal candidate and against Helmut because he stuck to me. In the company of these new comrades, I experienced a mild repetition of the disillusionment I had suffered in the first 24 hours of my military service. But since I was now hardened and experienced, I was better prepared for the jolt. We travelled by rail through occupied Denmark, and from there by ship to neutral Sweden. Since the Swedes feared the Soviets even more than the Germans, they were persuaded to let us travel through southern Sweden to the Norwegian border, where we were in occupied territory again. We spent about a week in Oslo, where we freely mingled with a population that was standoffish but not hostile. The first day I bought a huge bag of broiled shrimp, found a picturesque place by the harbour, and enjoyed the splendid food and scenery. There also was a soldiers' home with German and Norwegian Red Cross nurses. But in the cosy atmosphere of the Norwegian capital, this comfort was hardly needed. In the following days I strolled aimlessly through the streets of the pleasant city, dined in obscure restaurants on whale and ale, and enjoyed the seemingly peaceful atmosphere. Of course, had I known about the Norwegian underground resistance, I would have moved around more carefully. We had no idea what we were doing in Norway, nor where we were going. Eventually, we boarded a train and travelled north to Trondheim, where, to our astonishment, we were instructed to switch to a Swedish train. We first travelled east to the Swedish border, where we were briefed by a German SD officer. SD stands for Sicherheitsdienst, a special branch of the SS, here used for border patrol. This man told us that we were on our way through Sweden to Finland. There was an agreement, he said, between Germany and Sweden that German military units could travel through Swedish territory, provided that the troops were strictly separated from their ammunition. If any one of us still carried any ammunition, he cautioned, this was the time to surrender it. The days were getting shorter now and colder. The train was electrified and abundantly illuminated, and so were the train stations. But they were few and far between. At every station, nurses from the Swedish Red Cross offered us food, hot coffee, and Swedish ale. They were surprisingly friendly, but watched carefully that none of us left the train. It was a surreal atmosphere. The dark wintry night, the glaring electric lights, the almost luxurious train, the friendly Swedish women in their white costumes, and the German soldiers dazzled by this island of peace. As the train rolled ever farther north, I saw an extraordinarily beautiful polar light, Aurora Borealis. Usually the polar lights are greenish, and I saw hundreds of them in the cold winter nights at the Arctic Ocean, but this one was brilliantly red and blue. The resplendent spectacle, a comfortable train, and the Swedish hospitality heightened my spirits. For a while I was tempted to succumb to Paul's romantic dreams of a chivalrous soldier in a gallant war. It was the last time I felt this temptation. The last Swedish town was Haparanda, at the northern end of the Gulf of Bothnia, where we crossed the border to Finland. If my memory serves me right, the Swedish train proceeded to the Finnish border town of Tornio, where we took a Finnish train to Kemi. By northern standards, Kemi was a large town. Everything seemed to be made of wood: the houses, the churches, the skis, fuel for the locomotives, even the pavements. At a little churchyard, a funeral was going on. It was a gloomy visual spectacle, and an even gloomier auditory one. I believe northerners like lugubrious music in minor keys. Witness Edvard Grieg and Jean Sibelius. Not that I dislike this music, to the contrary. I savour the sombre atmosphere, which reflects the earnestness of the northerners without denying their hidden humour. The impression grew as I got better acquainted with Finland. I sometimes had the feeling that the whole country was in a minor key. Much later in America, when I saw the movie Dr. Zhivago, I was reminded of the melancholy Finnish landscape. Winter was around the corner and had already brought a dusting of snow to Kemi. In a few weeks, the people would no longer be able to dig a grave. As Helmut and I strolled through the town square, I was wondering about the many bicycles leaning against trees and fences, apparently without owners. Pointing them out to Helmut and counting them aloud, I expressed my puzzlement. "Where are the owners?" I cried. At that moment, a Finnish Lotta, female conscripts serving as nurses, approached us and asked me in fluent German why I was so perplexed. When I uttered something about thieves, she smiled and said, "There are no thieves in Kemi." She then explained that people in her country routinely left their bicycles at public places to pick them up the next day, or week. But in Germany... That's all I could say before she took a bicycle from a tree, smiled, waved, and pedalled off. I also noticed that people placed silver trays in front of their house doors for bread and rolls to be delivered the next morning. Apparently the Lotta was right. There were no thieves in Kemi. Too bad that I could not say this of my own people and my comrades. The master race could learn a lesson here. But then the Finnish people had a much easier life. They faced only a fraction of our enemies. No, that was not true. Just a few years ago they were fighting the mighty Soviet Empire completely on their own. Their hardships were even greater than ours. So why were they so trustful and serene? And why were there so many thieves among us? I did not know the answers to these questions. I needed time to think them through. But for now, I had better watch out that none of my comrades took advantage of the enviable self-confidence of this small nation. A few hours later, we boarded a Finnish train to continue our journey to the north. This one was quite different from the Swedish trains. Old-fashioned and only sparely illuminated, it was pulled by a surprisingly small steam locomotive fueled by wood. 20 years later, when I watched Western movies in America, I was reminded of the little Finnish locomotive groaning with exhaustion. The first snow was falling, and the long winter night was approaching. We were travelling through a vast landscape of lakes and forests that showed almost no sign of habitation. Every hour or so the train stopped at a large woodpile to refuel. We used these opportunities to step out and conduct snowball fights. There was no danger of missing the train because it accelerated so slowly that one could run after it and still catch it. Eventually we reached Rovaniemi, the capital of Lapland that is situated slightly north of the Arctic Circle. At the time it was the end point of the railroad. Rovaniemi was smaller than Kemi and much more of a frontier town. We spent several days there, mainly within the confines of a transition camp of the German army. There was a soldier's home, but entrance was restricted because it was highly popular with German soldiers. The place of the friendly Swedish Red Cross nurses was now taken by the even friendlier Finnish Lottas. Finland had been in a state of intermittent war since 1918, mostly against Soviet Russia, but sometimes against their own sympathizers with the Soviets. The bloodiest of these fights was the Winter War against Soviet Russia that began in November 1939. In the peace of 1940, Finland lost important territories that held 12% of the Finnish population. Thus, Finland was used to war even more than Germany. Everybody had to serve in one capacity or another, and the Finnish Lottas had a reputation of exemplary service to their country. Rovaniemi was also the headquarters of the 20th Mountain Army, under the command of Colonel-General Edward Dietl, the conqueror of Narvik. The mountaineers, whom I would join a year later, were the famous Edelweiss troops who had distinguished themselves in the campaigns in Norway and Crete. Now they were defending North Finland against vastly superior Russian forces. General Dietl was one of the most popular war heroes in Germany, but he would soon fall out of favour with the Führer. While reporting to Hitler at his Führer headquarters, General Dietl apparently suggested that Hitler seek peace with the Western Allies. When he left headquarters by air, his plane exploded shortly after takeoff. The story is reminiscent of the fate of other German leaders, such as Dr. Fritz Todt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Of course, I got this information only after the war. The Finnish front against Russia consisted of two sections, one for the German forces and one for the Finnish forces. The German section from Rovaniemi north to the Arctic Ocean was the responsibility of the 20th Mountain Army, and the section from Rovaniemi south to Leningrad was manned by the Finnish army. The German part was called Die Eismeer Front, the Arctic Ocean Front. Its backbone was the Eismeerstrasse, Arctic Ocean Road. This dirt road, which had been upgraded by the Germans, extended 550 kilometres from Rovaniemi to the Arctic Ocean. Since almost all of the logistics for the divisions of the 20th Army had to travel along the Arctic Ocean Road, this artery was a constant concern of German commanders. The most vigilant of these leaders was General Ferdinand Schorner, conqueror of Crete and now commanding general of the 19th Mountain Army Corps, at the extreme north of the Arctic Ocean front. Schorner was a legend not only among the German soldiers, but the Russians as well. A brave soldier and a fanatical Nazi, he had a reputation for ruthlessness that showed itself in his methods of protecting the Arctic Ocean road. The hundreds of trucks that used the road strained it almost beyond capacity. When one truck was following another, their tire tracks had to be offset from each other so that the road would not be hollowed. The penalties for disregarding this order were harsh, and the rumour was that Schorner court-martialed and executed violators on the spot. I saw graves with crosses along the road, but I am not sure whether the men buried there were victims of Schorner's alleged kangaroo courts. In 1943, Hitler called Schorner to the Baltic section of the Eastern Front and soon thereafter promoted him to Field Marshal. As commander of the Army Group Centre, Schorner defended Silesia and the city of Breslau. His attempts to save as many people as possible from the Russians were sincere and laudable. There is no question that he was a brave and able soldier, but there were also some indications that he caused unnecessary losses by blindly following Hitler's irrational orders. He reigned with an iron fist, and in the last months of the war gave the order that any soldier who was found without written orders behind the front line would be hanged on the spot. Small wonder that he was the Führer's favourite troop commander. One of the few Nazis among the field marshals, he was unpopular with the other generals, but not always with his own troops. After Hitler had committed suicide and Germany had surrendered, Schorner tried to save his army group and part of the civilian population from the Russians by fighting his way to the west. He surrendered to the Americans, but was returned to the Russians. He then spent several years in Russian captivity, but apparently was treated relatively well because Stalin wanted him to organize the newly created East German Army. But Schorner declined and was released several years later. After his return to Germany, he was court-martialed by the West German Army for war crimes and found guilty on several counts. A little later he died. I met Schorner once at the Arctic Ocean front and shook hands with him. He was followed by 2 Kettenhunde, chain dogs. This was the nickname for the military police, who were characterized by large badges hanging on chains from their necks. Since they were also quite unpopular, the soldiers referred to them by this unflattering name. I felt intimidated by the stern general and the military police. Though the meeting lasted only a few minutes, I had the uneasy feeling that I would have to fear this man if I saw more of him. Under the circumstances, however, I was awed. 40 years later, long after I had moved to America, Helmut sent me a biography of Schorner from the library of the neo-Nazis. It presented the late Field Marshal in glowing terms and attempted to belittle the serious charges against him. Nevertheless, the belated reports from the epic struggle in the cold and dark of the Arctic winter were an emotional experience to me. The Finnish leader was Field Marshal Baron Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, who had served already under the last Tsar when Finland was part of Russia. Having distinguished himself in the heroic Winter War of 1939, Mannerheim was highly regarded by German soldiers of the Arctic Ocean front. He also was Hitler's favourite ally until he negotiated the Finnish surrender in September 1944. Since he was of Swedish nobility, the Nazi propaganda was happy to have no problem with his Aryan pedigree. The Finnish language posed a more difficult problem, since it does not belong to the Indo-Germanic, but to the Finno-Ugrian languages, a fact that the Nazi propaganda played down. The complete integration of Finland's Jewish population into Finnish society was another feature of the Nordic people the Nazi propaganda withheld from us. Today, I believe it reflects high credit on this brave nation that the murderers of the concentration camps could never lay their hands on Finnish Jews. After a week in Rovaniemi, we continued our journey by truck on the Arctic Ocean Road. At first, there were seemingly endless pine forests. Eventually, however, the trees became scarcer as we were approaching the northern tree line, and always snow and more snow. It also got colder, and we became alarmed that we were ill-equipped for this climate. First we went to Kirkenes in northern Norway, where I saw the Arctic Ocean, Barents Sea, for the first time. The water, though pristine, was green because of light conditions. 1 year later, when I was on patrol along a cliff high above the ocean, I observed a school of whales travelling in an undulating motion through the icy water, which, to my surprise, had changed its colour to a Mediterranean azure. From Kirkenes we travelled east, always by truck, to the Petsamo Air Base in northern Finland, which was situated some 30 kilometres behind the front line and about an equal distance from the ocean. The name Petsamo, Pechenga in Russian, denotes a district rather than a town. An area of the size of Greater Los Angeles, it counted only a few hundred inhabitants. The harbour, Linkhamari, was primitive, yet boasted a hotel. Occasionally, a German supply ship would arrive there, but most of the time the sea lane was interdicted by the British Navy. Petsamo was Finland's only access to the Arctic Ocean. The harbour does not freeze in the winter because it is heated by the Gulf Stream, which brings warm water from the Gulf of Mexico. The Russian harbour of Murmansk benefits from the same natural heating system, whereas the harbour of Archangel, though considerably farther south, is frozen half of the year because of its remoteness from the Gulf Stream. After Finland's capitulation, Russia annexed the Petsamo area, thus depriving the brave nation of a harbour which today would be of even greater value than in the past. Under the Soviets, the whole area was a strategically sensitive air, missile and submarine base. Today it is still difficult to gain access to the area. Helmut tried it in 1996 and was deterred by the exorbitantly high entrance fee. He travelled all the way through Norway and Finland, enjoyed the hospitality of the two nations, and took part in the festivities of the summer solstice. I never went back to the old places. I would have liked to revisit the former battlefields and see the Murmansk that we had besieged for so long. I still remember standing high on a cliff, looking down at the green Arctic Ocean, little knowing at the time that, almost half a century later, my youngest son, Julius, would cruise the waters in an American submarine and come closer to Murmansk than I ever did. The Petsamo Air Base was a fighter and bomber base. The mission of the bombers was mainly to intercept the convoys that brought supplies from America to Murmansk. The German Navy had installed artillery along the short coastline of the Petsamo area, the only heavy artillery the German troops in the north ever had. When a convoy arrived bound for Murmansk, we could infer it from the artillery fire of both sides. The German guns aimed at the ships at sea, and the Russian guns were trained at ours. It was an uneven contest because the Russian artillery, being of larger calibre, was out of reach of the German artillery. Murmansk played a decisive role in World War II. When the German armies advanced eastward on a front extending from Leningrad to the Black Sea, they deprived Russia of much of its industry and supplies. However, through its northernmost harbour, Russia received an almost endless supply of weapons and material from America. Preventing these supplies from reaching their destination was one of the missions of the German land, air and sea forces in northern Finland. But the primary mission was something else. There was nickel in northern Finland. The mine was in Kolosjoki, now Nickel, Russia. Hitler, whose military instinct sometimes served him well, already had his eyes on the Finnish mineral resources before he invaded Russia. That was one of the reasons why he occupied Norway all the way up to Narvik. It was not a temporary expedient, but an integral step of his grandiose plan to conquer the Lebensraum that would provide, aside from arable land, raw materials such as oil and minerals. The nickel ore would travel from Kolosjoki through Sweden to Narvik, from where it could reach Germany either by land or by sea. The security of the nickel supply was the primary mission of the 20th Mountain Army. Life at the Petsamo Air Base was hard, but incomparably easier than the life of the mountaineers at the front. At least we had heated barracks and petroleum lamps. We also had better winter clothes. There was even a limited supply of fur coats and felt boots for those who were momentarily exposed to the extreme cold. The mountaineers had none of this, not even in 1943 when I joined them. But I did not know this at the time, and naively enjoyed the preferential treatment, which we owed to Reichsmarschall Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. The base commander was a major who had spent several years in Finland and was fluent in the language. After a few weeks, he detailed me to assist the sergeant who ran the airbase command. This makeshift office was housed in a shabby barrack that was buried in the snow to keep it warm. It was equipped with a telephone, a stove, a kerosene lamp, a supply of firewood, and a huge dog. I volunteered to spend the night in this haphazard building to man the telephone. My only companion was the dog, who slept on top of me to keep me warm and to ward the lemmings off my face. In the morning he left me to seek food from the lotters who operated the base kitchen, and in the evening he returned to me to seek shelter. Christmas was approaching. The reports from the front were worrisome, but not nearly as alarming as the situation really was. It was an unusually cold winter, even by Russian standards, and the German army was ill-equipped for this merciless climate, since Hitler had promised his generals at the beginning of the not a temporary expedient, but an integral step of his grandiose plan to conquer the Lebensraum that would provide, aside from arable land, raw materials such as oil and minerals. The nickel ore would travel from Kolosjoki through Sweden to Narvik, from where it could reach Germany, either by land or by sea. The security of the nickel supply was the primary mission of the 20th Mountain Army. Life at the Petsamo Air Base was hard, but incomparably easier than the life of the mountaineers at the front. At least we had heated barracks and petroleum lamps. We also had better winter clothes. There was even a limited supply of fur coats and felt boots for those who were momentarily exposed to the extreme cold. The mountaineers had none of this, not even in 1943 when I joined them. But I did not know this at the time, and naively enjoyed the preferential treatment, which we owed to Reichsmarschall Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. The base commander was a major who had spent several years in Finland and was fluent in the language. After a few weeks, he detailed me to assist the sergeant who ran the airbase command. This makeshift office was housed in a shabby barrack that was buried in the snow to keep it warm. It was equipped with a telephone, a stove, a kerosene lamp, a supply of firewood, and a huge dog. I volunteered to spend the night in this haphazard building to man the telephone. My only companion was the dog, who slept on top of me to keep me warm and to ward the lemmings off my face. In the morning he left me to seek food from the lotters who operated the base kitchen, and in the evening he returned to me to seek shelter. Christmas was approaching. The reports from the front were worrisome, but not nearly as alarming as the situation really was. It was an unusually cold winter, even by Russian standards, and the German army was ill-equipped for this merciless climate, since Hitler had promised his generals at the beginning of the expressed in the jargon of Nazi propaganda and explained in terms of the Jewish conspiracy. I had neither the leisure nor the mental ability to perform the political analysis myself, but I was fully aware of the military implications. Now my worst fears had come true. Germany was encircled by the three greatest powers on earth. They commanded the resources of huge secondary countries such as China, India, Australia, and Canada. I considered it a masterstroke of the international conspiracy, which now turned out to be as real and infinitely more dangerous than the Stürmer had warned us. Why did they hate us so much? I had long ceased hating collectively and anonymously. I hated only the war, nothing else. Mercifully, the daily life of the soldier did not grant me much time and leisure to ponder these ominous developments. Then came Christmas. Some of us had to stand watch at the harbour, where a ship with supplies had arrived. Others had to guard the truck convoys that took off from there. I was fortunate enough to spend Christmas night on my solitary telephone post at the base command, where I listened to a radio report on Christmas on the Eastern Front. The report sampled several army outposts, some buried in snow, some close to enemy lines. At one regiment, the soldiers hosted a party leader whose voice sounded familiar to me. It was Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, who had composed the bombastic youth hymn we had sung in the Jungvolk. He was not the worst of the Nazis by far. At least he had the shadow of a soul that enabled him to hit the magic Christmas mood. This night he sounded like a crafty clergyman comforting a congregation in distress. But he did not comfort me. he only filled me with a burning desire for peace. The emotional effect of the nostalgic speech was amplified by the Christmas carols, sung by the rough voices of the soldiers. There were also voices from home. Children were singing, church bells were ringing, and women were sending their love. When it ended, I was so overcome with emotion that I grabbed my blanket and ran outside into the icy winter night. This was a risky undertaking, since a few minutes of exposure at 50 degrees centigrade below freezing can be fatal. I suppose I was looking for some sign, some answer to my solitary quest for peace. Shivering in the merciless cold, I looked up to the stars that were as big as giants' eyes. A polar light ghosted with unearthly speed over the motionless celestial background. It was a dazzling symphony of silence, but no answer to my worried question. The base commander was fairly well educated and socially skilled. I had the feeling that there was a certain rapport between him and me, and I hoped that he would promote me to corporal, particularly since I was already a corporal candidate. But I was disappointed. The merry major used his skills and fluency in the Finnish language mainly to socialize with the lotters. On my telephone post, I had to connect him with the ladies, who seemed to pursue him with as much ardor as he chased them. Though I did not understand a word of the conversation, I understood enough to envy the bon vivant of Petsamo. Meanwhile, the expansion of the airbase, as ordered by the German Air Command in Oslo, was neglected. Soon the all-too-sociable major was replaced by another major who was almost the exact opposite. A native of Hungary and fluent in the language, he was rough and unmannered, but quite effective. Under his leadership, the airbase grew quickly and deuced ever more bomber and fighter sorties. His pet project was the replacement of the shabby barrack, which housed the command headquarters, by a new barrack that was extravagantly spacious in comparison. He brought with him a woman from Austria. I presume she was his mistress, who had a certain predilection for intrigues and presumption of authority. Conflict between me and the power-hungry lady was inevitable. But in spite of the disputes I had with her, the major soon promoted me to corporal and put me in command of the new headquarters. There was another woman who played quite a mysterious role at the airbase. A stunning blonde from Sweden, she was assigned to the base command as an interpreter. Though she had no security clearance, she liked to look over my shoulder, showing a conspicuous interest in the secret telegrams from higher headquarters. She also frequented the officers' barracks, an activity that got her in trouble with the Austrian mistress. I was anxious to see the outcome of the burgeoning struggle between the two Valkyries, but I missed it because of my upcoming leave. When I returned, the Swedish woman was gone. The rumour was that she had been executed for espionage. My long-awaited leave occurred in the summer of 1942. I was fortunate to find a seat on a Junkers 52 cargo plane, which flew first from Petsamo to Pori in southern Finland. From there it was scheduled to fly to Königsberg, East Prussia, now Kaliningrad, Russia. But over the Gulf of Finland, only a few miles from Leningrad, the aircraft was attacked by Russian fighter planes and hit in one fuel tank, which caused it to lose fuel. The next airfield was Reval, Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, and that's where we then headed for an emergency landing. In the meantime, the fumes from the damaged fuel tank came into the cabin and made all of us violently sick. There was no other remedy than holding one's head out of the window, hoping that altitude, airspeed and temperature would cooperate, which they did. A few minutes later, we landed safely. In Reval, I boarded another Junkers 52 that took me to Königsberg, which was a pleasant city with a rich historical past. I thought of Immanuel Kant, who had spent his entire life there without ever setting foot in any other larger city. I then took an express train to Posen, Polish Poznan, the capital of the western province of Poland the Nazis had annexed in 1939. There I boarded a commuter train to a nearby village where the farm of Helmut's parents was located. Helmut wanted me to visit his parents, and I obliged, not entirely without selfish interest, for I was hoping to get some food for my parents, who were starving. The commuter train was used by Polish farm workers who were on their way to the various farms that were all in German hands. In this train I had another encounter with Nazi arrogance. Though Germans and Poles were strictly segregated, I couldn't help noticing that I was surrounded by Poles. But I didn't mind. Their demeanour had an almost Mediterranean flavour, merry and noisy, and while they laughed and chatted, they lured ever more kinsmen into the cabin so that it became quite crowded. Some carried produce, others small animals. It was a carnival atmosphere, and I was quite animated, even though I could not take my thoughts off my parents, who already suffered from food shortages and Allied bombing raids. I was just happy to see happy faces. When the cheerful people noticed that I enjoyed their hustle and bustle, they even smiled at me. Alas, the fun would not last long. At one train stop, a government functionary in uniform entered the cabin, and the laughing and babbling ended abruptly. In the typical manner of the master race, the fatuous hireling chased the harmless people from the cabin as if they were animals. He then tried to reproach me for having tolerated a transgression by his subjects, but I cut him short and told him that I had better things to do than enforcing rules in which I did not believe. The answer left him speechless. Silently we sat facing one another in the empty cabin until the train arrived at Helmut's village, where his father picked me up in a horse-drawn carriage. The parents were warm and decent people who treated me like a king. Only when I mentioned the story of the commuter train did they become temporarily uncommunicative. When I departed the next day, they loaded me with so much food that I could hardly carry it, particularly the freshly slaughtered duck, which I had to hide from hungry onlookers, Poles as well as Germans. I would never see the old man again, but the mother I met once more after the war, together with Helmut in West Germany. While Helmut had become an incorrigible neo-Nazi, his mother had turned into an unbearably sanctimonious religious sectarian. The train ride was relatively uneventful. In Berlin, I had to switch trains, but I was in no mood to see the imposing buildings that were still being erected on Hitler's orders. So I went to the zoological garden next to the railway station. It was a pleasant summer Sunday, enjoyed by a large crowd. 2 years later, the whole area would be rubble. As I was watching the lions, I noticed a procession of women dressed in rustic garments and wearing scarves, who were chatting in a foreign language. It was clear to me that they were alien labourers in the armament industry, but not that they were forced labourers. Since my eyes were not trained for such things, I noticed neither signs of starvation nor any other distress. An hour later, I boarded a military express train to the west, which was so crowded that I hardly could get in. The closer the train approached the industrial Ruhr district, the more damage from the bombing raids became noticeable. The railroad station of Dortmund was quite damaged, but still functioning, and so was the city. This was the last time I was able to ride the streetcar. On my next leave, I would climb over smouldering rubble. My parents were so touched that neither was able to say a word. I was shocked at how emaciated they looked. But when I spread out all the food from Helmut's parents, our spirits lifted. The next day I picked up my ration cards and the Führer package, which was Hitler's gift to the front soldiers on home leave. It contained a canister of sunflower oil, some flour, sugar, and other delicacies he had pilfered from occupied Ukraine. German morale was still high. Most people stuck to their belief that Germany would win the war, my father and I included. The Goebbels propaganda encouraged that belief by leaking rumours of miracle weapons, which the Führer was holding in reserve to be used at the right moment. I fervently hoped so, because my faith had been shaken ever since Hitler had declared war on America. I could not help seeing a disturbing element of emotional rashness in that decision, and I was desperately looking for some explanation that would make it appear more rational. In this predicament, the tales of the miracle weapons came in handy. When the last battle was fought, I persuaded myself, it would turn out that the Führer knew all along what he was doing. The only casualty was the doctrine of the Jewish conspiracy. To me, though not to my father, this bogeyman had gradually lost some of its terror. If the American Jews really wanted this war, they could have started it much earlier. They certainly didn't have to wait until Hitler did it for them. No, this was an old-fashioned power struggle. Stalin had tried to expand his empire to the west, and the Führer was now using the opportunity to conquer the Lebensraum he wrote about in his book. My father did not deny the Lebensraum theory, but he still thought that the primary force behind this war was the Jewish conspiracy. He still travelled once a week to the other end of town to post the latest issue of the Stürmer at the fence of the state court, an activity that I now considered a tilt at windmills, but I did not tell him that. In fact, we no longer talked as much about the Jews as we did before the war, because our minds were now occupied with more pressing problems, such as food, the bombing raids, and the huge numbers of men killed in action. My mother told me that she would stand by the window every morning and watch the local party leader visiting families in the neighbourhood to bring them the sad news that their son had been killed in action, and every morning she prayed that he would not come to her. Once he did come to our house, but he skipped the lower story where we lived and went up the stairs. Minutes later there was inconsolable crying. Freddie, whom we knew well, had been killed. By sheer coincidence, my older brother also came home on leave at this time, so we had a few days together. He was with an army division that, at one time during the Russian campaign, reached the Caspian Sea almost 500 kilometers east of Stalingrad. Fortunately, he did not belong to the 6th Army that was annihilated in the Battle of Stalingrad. My younger brother, who still attended high school, served as an anti-aircraft gunner. Instruction took place at the outskirts of the city next to the cannons. The teachers, mostly older men, travelled on bicycle from one cannon site to the next. My sister, who was the youngest, had been evacuated with her school to a resort hotel in the Carpathian Mountains of Czechoslovakia. Almost every night the sirens sounded, and we had to descend into the cellar, which had been converted into an air raid shelter. There we heard gruesome tales about the raids, some so graphic that they made us sick. Today I wonder why, in this macabre environment, the even more horrible events of the concentration camps were never mentioned. I ask myself whether anybody knew about them at the time. I am virtually certain that my mother did not know, because she would have told me so after the war, when we discussed the ever-growing evidence of the events that were later called the Holocaust. My father had more opportunity to know because of his professional activities, but even after the war, he denied the atrocities of the concentration camps. Since my father had a talent for drawing and painting, he had decorated the shelter with caricatures, which were supposed to boost morale. Interestingly, his ridicule was directed almost exclusively against Churchill. I believe this was a reflection of the well-known fact that nobody aroused Hitler's ire more than the British leader. On the radio, the Goebbels propaganda flooded us with tales about Churchill's lies and crimes, accompanied by mock songs about the Lord of Lies from the sea piracy. Even before the war, Hitler referred to Churchill as the notorious drinker. Now the dogged warrior with the cigar graced the walls of our air raid shelter. To my great relief, there were none of the ugly anti-Semitic caricatures from the Stürmer. In spite of his war injuries, my father was house warden for air raid protection, which gave him police power and made him responsible for the whole house from top to bottom. When the bombs were falling, he climbed the stairs to watch under the roof for incendiary bombs. At the same time, he was responsible for the blackout, the water reserves under the roof and in the shelter, medical equipment, gas masks, and emergency equipment. Though these duties were almost beyond his physical capacity, I think they helped him psychologically by diverting his attention from his anti-Semitic hatred to the needs of the moment. My mother was in more dire straits. The worry about her 3 sons, the acute food shortages, the blackout, the nights in the bomb shelter, and the grisly tales of people burnt or buried alive had taken their toll. As the day of my farewell was approaching, she put all her love in a cake she wanted me to take along. I knew that it depleted her last food reserves, and when I later unwrapped it somewhere in Finland, I was so choked with emotion that I could hardly swallow it. Farewell was sad. On our way to the railway station, my father carried my rifle. The last minutes of waiting for the train were the worst. I still recall the announcer's voice, Achtung, Achtung, pulling in is express train for front soldiers. Maastricht, Köln, Berlin, Königsberg, Bialystok. It was a military express train for front soldiers that traversed half of Europe. Pulled by 2 huge locomotives and pushed by 2 more, it was so long that it did not fit into the station. When it finally came to a stop, the first 2 locomotives had disappeared in the distance, and the last 2 were not yet in sight. It was so crowded that there was no chance of finding even standing room somewhere in the middle section. Thus, we rushed toward the front end, I in front, followed by my mother and then my father, who carried the rifle and watched my half-blind mother. We climbed over tracks and ties, desperately trying to find a door I could enter. I had to get in at all cost. If I missed that train, the penalty would be harsh. My mother fell and my father had to help her up. Then he hobbled after me because he was still carrying the rifle. My mother could no longer follow and stood under the window of a first-class car, which was reserved for officers. From there I heard her imploring voice. "My God, gentlemen, please make room for my son. He is fighting for the Führer as well as you do." Now the station master arrived and tried to open a door for me, but the passengers inside desperately kept it shut. The military station commander was called, who arrived on crutches. A highly decorated officer with only one leg, he appealed to the passengers' sense of camaraderie. That helped. To my relief, the station master was able to open a door. Half laughing, half swearing, the two men pushed me in and closed the door behind me before my father could hand me the rifle. In the last minute, as the train already started to pull out, he handed the weapon through a window from where it found its way to me 4 hours later, when the train stopped in Berlin. Squeezed, but relieved to have found a place on the train, I could put only one foot on the floor, which prevented me from turning around to get a last glimpse of my parents. Instead of seeing their dear faces, I stared through the opposite window at a huge poster. Führer Befehl, wir folgen. Führer, give the order, we follow.